These air exercises are unprecedented. We have never done a U.S. Air Force sponsored air exercise with Ukraine before, and there are 8 other countries that are also participating. And so this allows U.S. Air Force, Ukrainian Air Force to train together. Many Ukrainians have never trained, with U.S. aircraft, and the reverse is true as well. So it's really very positive, and I think an example of U.S. and other countries' support for Ukraine.
What does it mean that these exercises are happening after the annexation of Crimea?
I think it's important, as we've seen after the annexation of Crimea, after Russia invaded the eastern part of Ukraine, that Ukraine be able to have sovereignty over its lands, and air sovereignty is an important part of that. And so helping Ukraine create capabilities in that area is an important thing.
We're like 300 miles from Russia. How grave is the threat from Russia?
Well, I think that we see Russia trying to undermine Ukraine across the board. So we've already mentioned Crimea. There is an active kinetic war, soldiers fighting in Ukraine's east. Every day, every 3 days, a Ukrainian soldier dies. Civilians die as well. Last Sunday, 3 children died because of landmines. So we see a kinetic war, soldiers fighting against each other. We see cyber attacks, constant cyber attacks, including, the first ever cyber attack on energy infrastructure. We see assassinations in downtown Kyiv as well as other places. We see the economic tool being used with various sanctions and so forth. So I think there is a lot of Russia is using a lot of tools against Ukraine.
When you talk about the cyber offensive, are those they've gone after infrastructure, they've tried to influence sort of the democracy here. What else, and what's the frequency of it?
I think it's constant. Constant
cyber influence from Russia.
Cyber attacks, yes.
One final one. Are there areas where Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. can work together? Are there any areas we have a joint space program? We just had, the test rocket went down. Where are there areas where all 3 can work together?
We're always looking for areas that we can work together, but that's a very challenging question right now.
And NBC's Hans Nichols is at the White House right now. Hans, we'd love to ask you about Marie Yovanovitch on the Hill today. She delivered a stinging rebuke of the president's foreign diplomacy in her opening remarks, saying the State Department was hollowed out from within. Any White House reaction yet to her claims?
Not yet. The president was speaking. You might see some reporters running back behind me. That's because the president is just wrapping up that conversation he had with the Chinese, and people are running back to file. So he may have mentioned something on Yovanovitch at the tail end of that. The notes that I saw didn't indicate that he had said anything on that specifically. I'm getting a thumbs down from a trusted source who was just in the Oval Office. So I'm going to go put his thumbs down on the record. When you listen to Yovanovitch there, when we spoke a year ago in eastern Ukraine, that's really an indication of what diplomacy is like. That's what a U.S. ambassador does. They go out to joint exercises. They engage with the media. They're not necessarily flashy. As a matter of fact, that interview didn't make air in our overall piece because, it was more about these F-15s up in the air. But it does give you an indication of the kind of person she is and the kind of painstaking diplomacy that she was engaged in. Now, we'll see whether or not she comes to the cameras today, if we're going to hear from her in more forceful language. But that was the diplomatic version. Allison?
So, Hans, let's get to why all these people are running around right now. We know the president was meeting with the vice premier of China today. Apparently that has wrapped up. What do we know?
So there was a meeting with the vice premier. The president announced that he had some sort of preliminary deal. He called it significant. It now looks like people are going out this door. I'm seeing both American and it looks like Chinese reporters, which could be an indication that the Chinese might talk as well. What happened in the Oval is just the president here. And it's at this point that I feel like, and I'm playing basketball in a full court press and need to have good peripheral vision, but it does
You're doing a great job.
It does look like people are heading out. And, most of the news came out of that from that conversation. There's a preliminary deal. There will be no additional sanctions. That came out just before markets closed at 4 p.m. on Friday. There's a lot more we need to figure out about the contours of this deal and the specifics. It's clear that this is just phase 1, and there will be multiple other iterations of this, and there will be trade delegations from the U.S. going to China to try to wrap that up.
Look, Hans, we know it's a really complex issue, but it seems like it's just good news that they're getting somewhere, because earlier this week we weren't even sure if these talks were going to happen in full. So whatever it is, sounds like a limited deal. Good news. And as you mentioned, the markets were up over 300 points, so they seem to like that as well.
Yeah, and the White House is very sensitive to what market reaction does. The president frequently talks about how people's 401ks are doing, how strong the economy is, how he can't be impeached because the economy is so strong. You know, earlier when there were reports that they had a deal, Secretary Mnuchin was asked about it on whether or not there was a deal and if the stock market was ahead of itself. And Mnuchin's comment was, the stock market is never wrong. So that's the kind of sense of how much stock they put in the stock market.
Hans, Mnuchin was talking about other things this afternoon as well, announcing that the White House is ready to impose sanctions on Turkey, but they are not activating them just yet. Do we know yet what might trigger that? And is this just playing to Republicans who are pretty upset about his moves over Syria?
So this allows for conversation to take place between the White House and Republicans on there might be economic sanctions. What we have today is a vessel, a shell, paperwork, however you want to say it, but there was not actual targeting of sanctions. We didn't get any indication of what would trigger those sanctions, who would be targeted, how severe they were. The only thing we really heard on that front is it'd be primary and secondary sanctions. Primary would be, a bank in Turkey. Secondary would be a bank in Germany that lends to Turkey. So by availing themselves of secondary sanction options, that gives you a sense that they're prepared to go much bigger on this. Now, that could all be part of the bluster. That could all be part of the scope. And I still think we need to hear from the president directly if and when he'd announce sanctions. He's also, I'm seeing more activity there. He's also going to be wheels up on his helicopter here. And whenever the president goes to takes off from the South Lawn, there's always the possibility that he stops before the cameras and unburdens himself of his day's thoughts and grievances.
Yeah, there's a strong possibility we may get some more thoughts and grievances today. Hans, while I have you, let me ask you another question. The Pentagon announcing today it will deploy thousands more troops to Saudi Arabia. What's going on there?
There are increased tensions in the Gulf, both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. There are reports of a tanker that was fired upon, an Iranian tanker that wasn't transmitting. The Pentagon had telegraphed this a couple weeks ago, saying they do about 1,000. They added a couple, 1,800 more, so almost doubled that number. I think we'll get into the 3,000 range. They were pains to say these additional troops are defensive in nature, involve some missile defense batteries, a couple air squadrons, handlers for all this. So it's not like they're sending in a group of commandos or special operators into Saudi Arabia to prepare or stage attack. They're defensive in nature, but it's an indication that the Pentagon at least wants to signal to the Iranians that they are prepared to play defense if things escalate. Because remember, the U.S. has about 50, 60,000 troops in the entire Middle East, and a lot of those are within range of Iranian assets. So when you start wargaming this out and thinking where it goes on the escalation ladder, officials at the Pentagon are always concerned that Iran has a serious military that can do serious damage to U.S. forces, and this has to do with protecting them.
Hans Nichols at the White House, where there is a whole lot going on. Thanks so much for running us through all that. We appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.